This research is looking at the interaction between maltreatment and teacher warmth and effects on peer relationships and emotion regulation. You ready, Eric?
Yeah.
Okay, go for it.
And thank you, Dr. Ellenboss, for the introduction. So because I'm researching maltreatment, I decided to use a developmental psychopathology framework because this is an important way to identify developmental outcomes and pathways that promote adaptation. Specifically, maltreated children are at a higher risk of developing deficits in emotion regulation and peer relationships, which are two outcomes that I incorporated in my study. For this study, I use the definition of emotion regulation to be the ability to respond to challenges by modulating their behavior and their emotional arousal in an acceptable manner. And it's important to note that emotion regulation is a really important adaptive skill that's shaped by their experience with caregivers. So this works in a scaffolding process where a child may experience emotional arousal and then their parents there to be sensitive, responsive, help them cope with their emotional problems, and then teach them skills that they can later use autonomously. But with maltreated children, they lack this experience. Their caregiver may be unresponsive. They may respond harshly. So that's an important thing to note. Maltreatment also impacts relationships because the child learns these negative expectations and they may fear victimization out of their relationship with their caregiver. And then this is applied to other relationships, such as with friendships. So children who experience maltreatment, they may increase distancing from their peers, and they may increase aggression. And that makes it hard to make friends. And friendships are really important because they're found to be a protective factor against externalizing behaviors and internalizing behaviors. But maltreated children have that risk of not being able to form these relationships. On a positive note, teachers are able to have a strong impact on their classroom. A lot of research shows that teachers who are warm and supportive to their students have positive impacts, for example, on behavioral outcomes and on decreased bullying. So there are some important gaps to highlight in the existing literature. For example, there's not a lot of research that goes into how to decrease victimization. There's a lot of research on the risk factors that may lead to victimization, as well as the consequences of being victimized. And there's also not a lot of research on the maltreated children in particular. Also, there's not a lot of research on the impact of student-teacher relationships on emotion regulation. There's a lot of focus on behavioral problems, and this may be because it's in the school context, so teachers want to find ways to decrease behavioral problems. But I think that emotion regulation should be a focus because it may be an underlying process that can explain behavioral outcomes, and it contributes to peer relationships as well. And lastly, there's not much research that goes into student-teacher relationships and how they relate to the maltreated population specifically. So while student-teacher relationships are found to benefit the classroom as a whole, there's not a lot of research that goes into the maltreated children and how it can affect them. But a lot of the benefits of student-teacher relationships benefit the deficits that maltreated children face, such as emotional problems, social problems. So it's interesting to tie into that. So for my study, I examined the processes that contribute to the deleterious effects of maltreatment on peer relationships and emotion regulation specifically. And I decided to tie in student-teacher relationships as a buffer because I think it's important to highlight how relationships can be a buffer in the school context. So here are my hypotheses. In line with the existing literature, I hypothesized that children who experience more subtypes of maltreatment will report lower emotion regulation skills. I also hypothesized that children who experience more subtypes of maltreatment will report having lower quality of peer relationships. And I define lower quality of peer relationships as being increasingly victimized and lacking the experience of pro-social behaviors. Lastly, I hypothesized that teacher warmth will buffer the development of poor emotion regulation as well as negative peer relationships. So my participants were taken from a previous study done at Maltreatment Family Center on the exposure of violence, on the effects of the exposure of violence. And I used 115 high-risk urban children from Rochester that had histories of maltreatment. And these were identified by a DHS employee, a Department of Human Services employee. And they were followed from ages 8 to 10 at time 1, and then 10 to 12, around 10 to 12 at time 2. They were a majority female at about 54%, and a vast majority of them identified as being a minority status, up to 89%. So at time 1, the maltreatment classification system was used in order to determine different subtypes of maltreatment. So neglect, physical abuse, emotional maltreatment, and sexual abuse. And then the ERC was used in order to measure emotional regulation, and this was completed by teachers at time 2. The STR was used to measure teacher warmth, which was also measured by the teachers, which was reported by the teachers. And then we utilized the SEQ, which measured the peer relationships, which was measured by student report, and that measured victimization and pro-social behaviors. So for my analyses, I looked at the moderating effect of teacher warmth and on their association between number of maltreatment subtypes and emotion regulation, as well as the moderating effect of maltreatment on the association between teacher warmth and pro-social behavior. And then direct pathways were also considered. So as you can see here, I laid out the significant pathways. So there were some significant pathways, from teacher warmth to emotional regulation. This was not what we anticipated. There was a negative association between teacher warmth and emotional regulation. It's important to investigate this in the context of the interaction. But based on my experience with the maltreatment population, I thought of some possible explanations for this negative association. It could be that increased teacher warmth leads to closeness with the teacher. So when they are comfortable with the teacher, they may feel more comfortable to express all their emotions. So that can look like lability. And then it could also be that when students finally break down their walls and they become close to their teachers, if something happens that they may feel let down by the teacher, they could lash out, which could look like decreased emotional regulation. And in line with what I hypothesized and with the current literature, there was a positive association between maltreatment and victimization. So as maltreatment increased, there was a higher association with both overt victimization and relational victimization. And then importantly from the study, the effect of the interaction between maltreatment subtypes and teacher warmth was significant for emotional regulation and for pro-social behavior. And in order to probe this interaction effect, I use a simple slope analysis. So with the graph on the left, the slope for low teacher warmth was significant and the slope for high teacher warmth was not. So this indicates that low teacher warmth is associated with decreased emotional regulation for multiply maltreated children. And then with the graph on the right, we were surprised by this to find that teacher warmth may not be equally beneficial for all maltreated children. Both slopes were marginally significant, I'll add. And then the children who had lower subtypes were benefited by high teacher warmth. So as teacher warmth increased for these less maltreated children, the pro-social behaviors increased. So this may indicate that teacher warmth can lead to more friendships, for example, which has positive benefits for children. And then interestingly, for the high maltreated children, those that are more multiply maltreated, teacher warmth was also found to decrease pro-social behaviors. So further research is needed to clarify this finding. Some possible explanations could be that maltreatment leads to social deficits, and this leads to an increased reliance on the teacher relationship. So they may be relying more on the teacher rather than with their peers. So that would look like lower pro-social behaviors. Alternatively, it could be that teachers may invest more in these children that demonstrate more peer difficulties. So it may be that there's more warmth going into the children who reported less pro-social behaviors. So there are some important limitations to discuss with my study. To start is with the sample size. The sample size was large enough in order to find significant pathways, but with a larger sample size, it'd be possible to find specific outcomes with certain subtypes of maltreatment, as well as how different combinations may lead to different outcomes as well. We also only use one time point for maltreatment and then one time point for the predictor, for the outcomes. So I would argue that using more time points would give a more developmental perspective. It'd be more extensive with more time points, and would be able to infer directionality or causality better. And I would also urge future studies to build on the constructs we use for this study. So I think of teacher warmth specifically. That was a teacher report. I think that behavioral observations and student report would be really important for that, so that you get as many different perspectives as possible to round out the construct. But with this study, there was a highlight on the importance of student-teacher relationships. So as we can all probably remember, school is a microcosm with a lot of stress, both emotional stress and peer conflicts. And it could be that teachers can potentiate these problems by demonstrating low teacher warmth. But importantly, on a positive side, student-teacher relationships can also be a point of intervention for maltreated children. Okay, so I would argue that by developing a strong student-teacher relationship, teachers can be a resource for these maltreated children who may not have the skills to navigate emotional conflicts and peer conflicts as well. So I would argue that schools should begin to focus more on how they impact the social and emotional development of children, rather than solely focused on maybe test scores and grades, for example. So to wrap it up, I would argue that creating a trauma-informed environment in the school would have a lot of benefits and promote resilience for maltreated children. I think that with trauma-informed care, it helps to educate on how trauma can lead to behaviors that teachers see. So externalizing behavior, psychopathology, emotional dysregulation. By understanding how trauma affects these outcomes, it's beneficial for the student and the teacher to have a better understanding of it. It also helps teachers understand that maltreated children respond differently. They can respond in a variety of ways, especially when forming relationships with the teacher. But ultimately, teachers can have a positive impact, as we saw, on emotional regulation and peer relationships by having a strong, positive student-teacher relationship. So by being warm, by being close with their students, they can be flexible to their needs, and they can lead to benefits in social and emotional development. All right, and now I will take questions if anybody has them.